Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Akshat Maini, and I'm a research assistant at the ICS. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm and humble welcome to all to today's special lecture titled DPP-KMT Contestation over the nature of relations with China, domestic dynamics, and the challenges from the PRC. The recent election campaigns in Taiwan involved communications between candidates, political parties, and voters. These exchanges covered a range of topics, including perspectives on sovereignty, relations with China, the United States, and other friendly nations. The chosen themes and stances of the campaign suggest a firming of positions on national defense across the political spectrum. However, disparities persist among parties concerning national sovereignty. On election day, voters conveyed impactful messages to the main parties, albeit disappointing all three. The re-election of the ruling Democratic Progressive Party for an unprecedented third consecutive term indicated the public's desire to defend Taiwan's sovereignty and maintain President Tsai Ing-wen's successful international outreach. Although the Kuomintang did not secure the presidency, it became the largest party in the legislature without achieving an outright majority. This outcome highlighted the public's lingering distrust of the KMT on sovereignty issues. On the other hand, the Taiwan People's Party, while placing third in the presidential race, garnered enough votes to signal a challenge to the main legacy parties in future elections. The implications for Taiwan going forward, both domestically and on the international stage, are significant. The evolving political landscape, marked by the emergence of the Taiwan People's Party, suggests a shifting dynamic that could shape Taiwan's future political trajectory. Today's special lecture, we have with us Mr. Courtney Donovan Smith, who is a regular columnist for Taiwan News, co-founder, editor, and host at Taiwan Report, co-publisher of Compass Magazine, and former chairman, Taichung American Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Smith is based in Taichung, Taiwan, and focuses mainly on political analysis and foreign affairs. He writes for various international and local publications, is regularly interviewed on the TV, radio, and international news outlets, and is a frequent guest for public speaking events and lectures. The special lecture shall be chaired by Dr. Arvind Gelvi, who is an associate professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He is also an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. Before that, he was a senior research fellow at Peking University in Beijing. He is also a visiting faculty at the Fudan School of Management, Shanghai. Was formerly an associate fellow and assistant director at the ICS. He holds a PhD in Chinese studies with a particular interest in political economy. He has co-edited Tailspin, The Politics of India-China Economic Relations in 2021, and authored China Incorporated Between State Capitalism and Economic Statecraft in 2020. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to please follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. Thank you, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Akshat, and thank you, ICS, for having another round of discussion on Taiwan elections. I also welcome our speaker, Courtney Donovan Smith, to ICS and this platform. ICS has been focusing especially on cross-strait Taiwan, looking into the present dynamics of elections in Taiwan and the repercussions of it. ICS had a recent Wednesday seminar on the same topic. And you coming all the way and joining us from Taichung and speaking about the electoral dynamics, the dynamics of party interactions, and especially talking about the two biggest parties, actually, DPP and Kuomintang. This brings a lot of benefits to all who join here online and would like to take opportunity to listen to you and interact with you and pose a lot of questions. As a chair, I feel that this is a very good opportunity for all of us. If you see that past couple of years, even before Pelosi's visit and the way China has been interacting with Taiwanese, or maybe creating an optics, a narrative of what are the challenges the Taiwan would face if the electoral politics revolves around independence, revolves around nationalism. And accordingly, it was a bit of challenging for parties like DPP, KMT, and then the new parties like TPP to take the selective items on agenda and speak about it. You may also try to reflect upon the trade relationship between China and mainland and Taiwan. How China has been using it as a hedge or the pressure point to influence the public opinion in China. The cases of rising inflation, the case of rising diversities, Taiwanese companies are now preferring to move out of mainland, how mainland receives all those um, fragments of thoughts, and how that is really affecting the cross-strait relationship. So with that, I know that this is not only about IR, this is not only about international relations domain, but specifically about electoral politics, domestic dynamics. And with that, I welcome Donovan to please help us know these dynamics much better. And thank you for joining us. Over to you, Donovan. You have approximately 20 to 30 minutes, so we have more time for discussions. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. By the way, I'm really glad to be here, and thank you for inviting me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through sort of some of the key points about the election. I'm sure that you're all familiar with the Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang, or the KMT. But what I'll do is I'll review a few things that may have changed since you learned about them. For example, I've noticed that there's certain American commentators that when they comment on Taiwan, it's like you can tell what era they learned about Taiwan in, because they're unaware of certain changes that have taken place. So I'm going to try and sort of bring everybody up to speed. I don't know when or where or how closely anybody follows it now, but I'll try and give you some insights into that. So the one party that you're probably not terribly familiar with is the Taiwan People's Party. This party only started in 2019, and it's led by Ko Wen-je, the former mayor of Taipei. Now, they have some advantages and some disadvantages. Structurally, it's very hard to get a third party off the ground. Historically, there have been 4 predecessors to them that briefly blossomed, and about 2 or 3 election cycles later, they were gone. So if the TPP is going to survive, they've definitely got a lot of hard work ahead of them. Now, it's also very hard to compete on resources. So that's another problem they have. Ideologically, they claim to be sort of between blue and green, meaning the KMT and the DPP. But most people, particularly outside of Taipei, view them as being a little bit closer to the KMT than to the DPP, although they do have DPP members in the party. So that's a little bit about them. Now, a big shift, and this is one of the ones that I think people don't realize, that there's, like I say, there's certain American analysts who don't really understand the significance of the sunflower movement in 2014. And then that was when the KMT negotiated a deal with China on a services pact. And then they wanted to use a procedural method to ram it through a legislative committee. Now, what happened is some activists stormed the legislature, held it for a few weeks. Hundreds of thousands of people came out in the streets in support. Now, the main reason for this is the content of the trade deal. It would have allowed Chinese businesses to come in and buy media. They could buy advertising companies, publishing houses, everything, just about everything. They could even do infrastructure projects. And I'm sure you're very well aware how the United Front works and how companies have to follow the orders of the CCP. So you can easily imagine how Taiwan's media landscape, had that gone through, would essentially be largely controlled at this point by China, for example. And that's just one element. They could have had, they could get involved in banking and finance, in telecommunications, and they can get access to medical records via medical businesses. So the amount of information they would have been able to collect about anybody in almost any facet of their lives would have been enormous. So now what happened after this movement is there was a political shift in the country. And what happened is the political center moved closer toward the DPP, the viewpoint of the DPP, meaning that sovereignty is important, more suspicious of China. And so that became more the center of gravity. And the KMT's way of viewing this, because they do believe in the one China principle, they advocate long-term unification with China. And of course, they support the 1992 consensus, which has the one China principle baked in it. So the center of gravity in national politics moved toward the DPP. Now that's one big mega trend that was coming into this election that was going to be tested, because it was running head on into a second mega trend. And that is, ever since 2000, each party has had 2 consecutive terms in office, and then the parties switch. So what that means is you've got these 2 divergent megatrends coming in and colliding in this one election. So that was one big thing that we were going to watch. Now, I should note the big difference between local elections and national elections. And there's been this pattern since 2016. And that is that in local elections, the KMT wins by a landslide. In national elections, in the last 2, in 2016 and 2020, the DPP won in a landslide. Now, obviously, the DPP won again this time, but it wasn't a landslide. Now, there does seem to be a sense that there's a segment of the population that wants the DPP to protect Taiwan's sovereignty, but they want the KMT to provide oversight. And also, they're much less concerned when it comes to local governments. Whether or not you believe in the one China principle or not, or the 1992 consensus, doesn't really matter, when you're constructing a pet park or working on sewage lines. So there's a kind of a difference in that way. In the last local elections in 2022, the DPP suffered their worst defeat ever when it came to city and county heads. So that's sort of how this dynamic has been playing out since 2016. Now, the major issues in this election, the big number one issue in Taiwan is always related to sovereignty, national defense, and self-identity and images, the sense of, do we identify more as Taiwanese or do we feel connected to China? And of course, cross-strait relations, what the scholar calls the China cleavage. Those are always the main dividing lines between the parties here in Taiwan. So now there are other issues, but that is the big one. Taiwan's politics is not, the two major parties are not really differentiated on left, right, or liberal and conservative. They're both liberal and both conservative, depending on who it is in the party. So now, some other issues that did make a little bit of a splash this time around. We had a big debate over nuclear energy. On all other forms of energy, their Their stances were all pretty similar, moving toward green energy and transitioning. But the role of nuclear energy was a big one. The DPP is opposed to it and wants it to phase out on schedule in 2025. The KMT supported it strongly, and the TPP supported keeping 2 of the 3 plants going, shutting down 1. And so that's the difference between the party on those ones. Now, there was a few other things that did come up in this election that were kind of interesting. The Me Too movement kind of broke out belatedly here in Taiwan early on in the election, and that had some impact on the campaigning around that time. It eventually hit all 3 parties. So how much damage any party took from it at the end of the day is really hard to say. But it was noteworthy and played a major role sort of early in the presidential campaign. Now, the DPP, excuse me, the DPP, one of the changes over the years, if you remember the old DPP from the Chen Shui-bian era, they were known for ferocious infighting, colorful characters, lots of drama. They're now the exact opposite of that. They're a tightly disciplined, extremely boring party at this point. They're politicians with I could say 2, maybe 3 exceptions, all pretty much say the same things. They talk about the same things. They're quite disciplined, and they're about as exciting as a stale box of crackers. But they're steady. So that's sort of the way that they have been campaigning. Now, the KMT throughout the campaign had a lot more infighting. It has a lot more colorful characters, many who will speak off the cuff and are more blunt, more dramatic personalities. And there's sort of a wider range of opinions coming from different KMT politicians. So they were a little bit more interesting, but their major problem is that their core ideology is still a hard sell with the public. And they have a problem. Their base, which are generally older and do show up at voting time, is much more old school KMT. So they need to appeal to them, but it makes it but it means that they're very unpopular with younger voters. Now, the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, they appealed to young voters, and they had an interesting social media interaction, and younger voters felt that they were more direct, spoke more to them, and were more practical, and they felt were more honest, and they wanted something different than the traditional KMT and DPP. Now, some signaling in the campaign, I think that might be important. William Lai of the DPP, he chose Xiaobi Kim. At the time was the de facto ambassador to Washington, D.C. And by all accounts, she may be the most successful Taiwan representative in Washington, at least decades. So he was signaling to the public that he wanted to continue strong relations with the United States. And so he chose a vice president that would help deepen that relationship. And of course, that is by extension, other allies and other countries like Japan that are quite important to Taiwan. Now, Lai doesn't have as much foreign policy experience as outgoing Tsai Ing-wen, so I think that was also part of the messaging. So I think that was a very interesting and important choice. So signaling domestically and internationally. Now, the KMT chose a vice president, Ho Yui. He was not doing very well with the base. Only about 2/3 of the base supported him. So he picked a VP and a candidate for Speaker of the legislature, both of them who are extremely popular with a deep blue base. And then Ho pivoted to a strong base message. So he abruptly shifted to a far more classic KMT style campaign, and he rose in the polls fairly significantly after doing that because he was able to consolidate that base. Okay, excuse me. Sorry, we have a lot of air pollution here and I smoke, so. Okay, so the presidential election results. William Lai of the DPP won with 40%. Ho Yo-ii of the KMT came in with 33.5%. And Ko Wen-je came in last, but fairly respectable for a candidate for a four-year-old party, 26.5%. Now, what's interesting is if this had been a two-way race, then we would have been able to really see those two megatrends that I talked about before colliding directly. So I crunched some numbers, which I won't bore you with all the details of this, but depending on how about a quarter of Ko Wen-je's voters moved one way or the other would have determined who won. I played out various scenarios. I think Lai would probably would have been more likely to win, but it still would have been very close, and Ho still could have won it. So, all right, now I just realized how little time we have here. Okay, the legislative race results. Now, there's three types of seats. Long story short here, the DPP and the KMT actually tied each other in the number of districts that they won. Now, there's a proportional representation by party section of the legislature. They tied in that. But the KMT won in the 6 indigenous seats. And so that tipped the balance, plus one independent who caucuses with the KMT. So they came out with a caucus of 54. The DPP came in with 51. And the TPP, because a majority is 57, that means that the TPP now holds the balance of power. And I suspect they're going to milk that for all it's worth. So in practice, unless there's a tie vote, though, the speaker and the deputy speaker, who are from the KMT, they're supposed to be neutral in legislative votes. So in practice, it's 52 to 51, again, unless it's a tie vote. So that's an interesting result. Another interesting result is that DPP voters in districts actually got 600,000 more votes than the KMT. But the reason that, and that's a large number in Taiwan. I know in India that sounds like a rounding error, but that's a lot of people in our electorate here. Now, the reason is two things happened here. One is that there are a lot of districts, particularly the indigenous ones and Jinmen and Matsu and places like this, that are KMT strongholds, but they have tiny numbers of people, but they get their own legislative seat. That's one reason. The other reason is that the DPP narrowly lost in 7 districts, and these are more populous ones. Now, the reasons that, and the KMT didn't lose by any close margins. So what the two possible reasons why the DPP lost these districts by 3% or less, I think there's two strong candidates here. One is that the KMT has a very good, or 3 candidates here. The KMT has a very good get out the vote machine. So they're very, very good at that. That's probably the biggest reason. Number two, though, is that there's a little bit of DPP fatigue because they've already been in power for 8 years. The third is some votes, not a large number, may have been swayed by Chinese propaganda, and it may have gotten them angry enough to go out and vote for the KMT. How big of a factor that is, I don't know, and I don't expect it to be the biggest one in a 3% win, but it is a possibility that it may have added some votes in there. Also, interestingly, on the proportional, the proportional representation seats, the DPP also won that by 200,000 votes, but that was not quite enough to get them one more seat over the KMT. So that tells you a little bit about the mood of the voters. Now, what is next for the parties? The TPP will need to stay viable because they're a new party, and generally parties don't last past about 3 election cycles. The KMT has a massive problem. And because I'm such a fun guy, I was actually looking through the KMT's finances, or all the parties' finances, and discovered something that I don't know, I haven't seen anywhere in Chinese or English. The KMT has been claiming the frozen, ill-gotten assets that the government froze, that they had, essentially stolen from the public during the martial law era. Those have been frozen by the government and are being transferred back to the state. The KMT has been claiming them as income and assets, even though they don't have them. And in reality, they have a $617.2 million hole in their budget. And I don't see how they can avoid bankruptcy unless they can somehow get those assets back. Or somebody like Terry Goh says, sure, I'll throw you $750 million or $2/3 of $1 billion US. So they're going to have to face that. The public's largely not aware of this. My readers are, and that's about it. Now, the subsidies, the annual subsidies that they get for the votes collected on the presidential race and on the party list race, the DPP got slightly, got 8.3 million annually subsidies from the government. The KMT got about 8.12 and about 5 million for the TPP. So this was a pretty big win for the TPP in terms of money. Okay, so moving on, obviously with no majority, and this is the first time, technically it's not the first time that this has happened, but in the past, in 2001, the last time no party had a majority, the KMT and their allies voted as a bloc, and they essentially ruled as a bloc. And that's when the terms pan blue and pan green came about, because each side had allied parties and they would vote as a bloc together. So that's where the term comes from. Okay, so all right, so the DPP and William Lai, looking at the time, I have maybe 5 minutes here. William Lai campaigned on outreach to the world, continuing Tsai Ing-wen's policies. He explicitly campaigned on, we're going to continue what Tsai Ing-wen has done in foreign affairs and cross-strait relations. We're going to change nothing. And that was a good plan, because while the DPP administration was not very popular when it came to domestic issues, generally speaking, in almost all opinion polling, when they asked specific questions about things that the Tsai administration had done with foreign policy and cross-strait relations, got very high marks from the public. So Lai is planning to be more of the same. So I think in the short term, we're not going to see any major changes when it comes to cross-strait relations, but there may be some differences coming up. Now, the big question, because if there's going to be any change in the status quo, it's going to come from the Chinese side, and in recent years, it always has. And of course, predicting what they're going to do is difficult. Obviously, there's been talk, and it was reported in Nikkei, that Xi Jinping particularly brought in Wang Huning to formulate new policies regarding Taiwan and cross-strait relations. We haven't seen anything yet. Does that mean he came up with something and it wasn't accepted? Does it mean he's still working on something? Or maybe the Nikkei report was wrong and he's working on something else. We don't really know. Now, you mentioned the Pelosi visit earlier, and this is a good example of kind of what I mean. The Pelosi, when she announced that she was coming, well, first she got COVID and then canceled it. But then the next time when she did actually make the trip, she only announced it like a week and a half, 2 weeks or so prior to arriving. Now, China released, they conducted mass-scale military live fire military exercises all around Taiwan. They had a list of thousands of products that they were going to ban, that they were being imported from Taiwan. There is no way logistically they could have done all of that in the week and a half or so that they had from Pelosi's announcement to when she arrived. So I think the logical conclusion here is that the Chinese side had long been planning to do this because the logistics were very complicated, and they were waiting for the right excuse to go ahead and do it. And that's, generally speaking, how the Chinese side operates. It waits for an opportunity, something that it can pretend to be outraged about, and then escalate the situation with Taiwan, changing the status quo, and then wait for a while, and then they do it again. So, and this has been a consistent pattern for a while now. So this is probably going to continue to happen under William Lai. If at some point they either Xi Jinping or Wang Huning or whoever decides to take a different strategy, we don't know, because ultimately it all comes down to what's going on in Xi Jinping's head. And he famously does not listen so much to a wide range of advisors these days from all the accounts that I hear. So it looks, so where things are going to go from here, again, I expect more of the same, both from the administration here in Taiwan and from China, but they may at some point, like I say, come up with a different strategic approach. But we don't know what that'll be because it's just too small of a circle discussing it in China. All right, so I think that's about it. I think I've used my time. So hopefully I can, I tried to speak as fast as possible, and I skipped a lot of stuff anyway, because I love to nerd out on stuff. But yes, questions.
So yeah, Donovan, you don't need to feel that you have skipped and you have left out something. Please hold on to those notes, because you need to go back and refer to those notes as we proceed further and take up the questions over here. I'll first take up the questions from those who are here, and then maybe I'll proceed and request Akshay to read out the questions which have been posted on the chat box. So anybody over here, please raise your hands and be very specific and short while putting up the questions. The floor is open for question and answers. Okay, Donovan, I think before the question comes in, let me ask the first question. I was pretty overwhelmed with the dynamics. Though you said that it is the DPP and KMT, looks like, bipartisan. Then you talked about the TPP. But I think lately the electoral reforms talked about, what should be the age of young voters. I think that also was, churned out a lot in the past couple of years. And with that, the question comes about the young voters. the young Taiwanese do not, I think, as I believe, care more about the employment, care more about the inflation, care more about the guarantees and the minimum wages, right? With that, the first question would be, what is your first reading about the young Taiwanese and their voting patterns? What is the general tendency among the young Taiwanese? What is your first line reading over here? I will come to my two subsequent questions later.
Yeah. So, okay, there are a few issues that that are very important to them. One is unaffordable housing. That's a big one. And wages. Those are the two big ones. The thing is that the party's stances when it came to things like the environment, and some of the other issues you were talking about, they're so similar between the three parties. They all came from the same sort of ideological place. So the young voters sort of like let the candidates know that they're interested in this. The candidates came out with plans that all sounded basically the same, with minor tweaks. So at the end of the day, I don't think that was what swayed voters. Now, inflation is fairly low here. Last I checked, it was just over 2%, and the central bank's target is 2%. So inflation was a problem, but it's now basically almost entirely under control now. Now that doesn't erase the damage that the previous inflation caused, but going forward, it looks like they've got it now largely under control. Now, as far as young voters, a few things to keep in mind about young voters. The parties want to appeal to them, obviously, because they want their votes, but I think in a way, more importantly, is they also want to cultivate new talent among the next generation. Now, all three parties have been aggressively trying to reach young voters. The KMT has been trying really hard, and I'll give the party chair, Eric Chu, a lot of credit. He's been doing quite a bit to try and reach out to them, but still largely to no avail. The DPP, I think that a lot of young voters feel like the DPP administration, when it comes to these things like housing and other things, have let them down. For example, the Tsai campaigned on raising the minimum wage to 30,000 NT, and now it's 27,000 something, and she's about to leave office. So she didn't manage to keep that campaign promise. They have been building social housing, but not yet met their targets. So I think there's also, I think, a lot of fatigue among younger voters. So the TPP was fresh.
Okay. So I think what I was, because the title is about the sovereignty, and the young generation, the young Taiwanese are concerned about the livelihood, the economics performance. Now, I wanted to put that question specifically vis-a-vis with the point of sovereignty, the question of independence. So all these questions, like DPP is not even recognizing the 1992 consensus. KMT goes with the consensus. Now, how the new voters being added to the party, how new voters have been convinced, and how the new voters look at these red lines which these parties have drawn between themselves. I think that was my specific questions. If they are interested in economics and these things, how that's going to affect that, or how that affects it.
Actually, just yesterday, both William Lai and Eric Chu, the KMT chairman, announced new initiatives to try and reach out to young voters. And Eric Chu dressed up in popular Japanese street fashion and Korean buddy fashion, and he had these young staffers dress him up, and anyway. If you ever want to take a look at it, you probably get a good laugh. I mean, the sovereignty issue is the thing that really turns off the young voters from the KMT. Their support among voters under 40 is atrocious. They can get a hardcore small base, mostly from families for traditional ethnic reasons. They come from families that fled China in 1949. They're indigenous or Hakka. But they're kind of dead in the water when it comes to younger voters until and unless they address these sovereignty issues. The TPP was a fresh voice, and Ko-wen-je rejected the 1992 consensus, but did talk about he wanted to open up negotiations with China, hoping to find some other formula. The problem is that the Chinese side would never accept that. They might accept a new formula, but they'll only accept it if the one China principle is embedded in it. So essentially what Ko was proposing was essentially a non-starter. So the younger voters went for the TPP in the largest amount for voters under 40. The TPP dominated that segment. The DPP did okay, and the KMT did terribly. That's sort of how the election turned out. Now, one important thing to keep in mind, the incoming younger demographics, they tend to not come to the polls as much, and the incoming demographics are shrinking rapidly. So they're going to become less and less important at the ballot box going forward.
Well, that's a good answer, Donovan. I'm just looking into those numbers when they come out. Actually, young voters, how many were registered over the period of time and whom they voted. I think that's a good answer. You were trying to point it out. May I now request
I spent hundreds
Rabbi,
of hours looking at polling data.
Yes, right. But I think when we look at Taiwan, the new frontiers of research and looking at how Taiwan is evolving, its response to the democratic system, institutions, one has to look at the younger generations and how they perceive and how they look at these institutions and system to evolve into. That's very important. Okay, can I invite now Rapai sir to put up his question, sir? Rapai sir, can you hear us? I'm not sure he's around. Okay, let me put the second question.
Well, the last one was easy to answer.
Yeah, I think he's around, but maybe some glitch over there. I'll ask you a question, Donovan, from a chat box. Mr. Rajkumar asked you a question. How DPP sees its stand on Taiwan as an independent state in medium to long range, and has KMT stand changed regarding it from their previous status quo ante with PRC?
Okay, the DPP has gone through, I guess you could call it 3 phases, or technically 4 phases. But the first phase is they kicked out. Basically, there was a schism in the original DPP, which came out of the Dangwai movement, and all the pro-unificationist members of the party, but who were pro-democracy, left. And then what was left was a strong pro-democracy party, and they got killed in the ballot box. So in it was 1999, they changed their party platform to include a referendum if they were going to make any move on declaring independence. But they continued to sort of talk about it, but made it a little bit more difficult. Tsai Ing-wen reframed the entire thing. And she very famously on BBC they asked her about declaring independence, and she just looked at the interviewer and she just said, "We don't need to declare independence. We are an independent country." And she kind of flipped the script there. She said, "We are the Republic of China. We are already an independent country." So now, and the way that she generally frames it, though, is that when she's giving speeches, she says, "Republic of China, Taiwan." So she's emphasizing that Taiwan is the Republic of China, but it is also Taiwan. So she doesn't want people to confuse it with, now she does this in English and Chinese, by the way. But they'll also, issue documents and things will also include that formulation. And now the KMT, they started moving toward stronger relations with China in the early 2000s, away from their 1990s stance of fierce anti-communism, massive military, huge investments in the Air Force, to this much more friendly relationship with the CCP. And the idea was they wanted to negotiate free trade deals, which they did get one in products, not the services one. And they initially pitched it as, "We'll all get rich, the economy will boom," which after the products pact didn't really happen. And of course, the PRC has been cutting products out of that agreement ever since. The KMT has tried to sound, the only major difference, I think, with Ho Yo-i and his predecessor candidates since Ma Ying-jeou is he did talk about a strong national defense. Ma Ying-jeou did as well, though. He said he campaigned on GDP spending on defense at 3%. In reality, he let it drop once he was in office to below 2%. So the military kind of atrophied a fair bit under him. The conscription period dropped to 4 months. Now the Tsai administration has reversed that. And by the way, that was popular according to polling. Conscription is starting this January, is back to 1 year, because it was felt that 4 months they couldn't learn enough. Now, initially when that policy was announced, Ho Yo-i came out against it, but I think he saw the polling, and then days later he did an abrupt turnaround and supported it. So he talked tough on defense. He was talking about a dialogue, defense, and deterrence. However, he wanted to bring back that services pact that I mentioned before, the one that would have opened publishing and media and all of that. So that's kind of because the KMT has a major problem in that their base firmly supports the 1992 consensus, and for various reasons, either because of their families or because they do business in China, or ideologically, they want to have a close relationship with China. So the KMT did have a chairman recently, prior to the current one, who tried to get rid of the 1992 consensus from the party's platform and failed. So they're stuck with the base that they have, so they keep campaigning on the same things.
Okay, so he has another question. He has two more questions to you, Donovan.
Oh,
he
good.
also says, what is DPP and KMT's stand on Taiwan going nuclear with the assistance from US in the mid and long term?
You mean nuclear weapons, I presume, versus nuclear power?
Yeah, he said just nuclear. Going nuclear, I don't know. We just said going nuclear, maybe nuclear technology.
I discussed the nuclear power in the presentation there. So I assume this is nuclear weapons. No party has proposed it. No party has talked about it. The topic never comes up. The United States shut down Taiwan's nuclear power, their nuclear weapons program in the 1980s. And I don't think anyone here is going to be willing to cross the United States on this. Now, the United States actually used to have nuclear weapons stationed here at one time. But obviously the defense treaty ended and they took the nuclear weapons back with them, presumably. But yeah, I think that's a non-starter here. A logical case could be made for it. But however, there are certain missiles that Taiwan is developing. They're conventional warheads. But some people have talked about using those conventional warheads because they have longer ranges now, of using them kind of like a nuclear weapon, like, for example, hitting the Three Gorges Dam. That would kill millions of people. Now, as far as I know, nobody in military circles is seriously talking about this, at least not publicly. But there have been people who've talked about it.
Okay, so one last question he has is about the Indian labor migration. DPP brought this in, and I think they were planning to have about 30,000 odd new jobs and Indian migrants welcome, and they were talking about it. So post elections, the question is that would they stand, accept, go ahead with the plan, or chances they want to dump it?
Okay, there was some misconceptions flying around at the time. There were these media reports that it was going to be 100,000 Indians, and they were all going to, and the impression that it gave was that there's 100,000 Indians were all going to arrive, over 1 week or something, like, over a very short period of time. Traditionally, the way Taiwan has done this is, now they came out and said, no numbers have been discussed. We're just discussing it with the Indian government. And we have not talked about any numbers at all as far as the number of people. And the way that Taiwan has traditionally done this is that when they open up to a new country, they start with small numbers and then slowly increase it. Because there are certain types of infrastructure and societal needs that need to be met. For example, when they started bringing in a lot more Indonesians, obviously you started having to worry about issues related to, say, halal food. And of course the Filipinos now, there's all kinds of little Filipino restaurants. There's all kinds of little Vietnamese restaurants and Thai restaurants and Indonesian restaurants. So you bring in, now all of those groups, now there are hundreds of thousands of them in Taiwan. So, but there are now mosques and halal restaurants and Vietnamese po, and so there's more here waiting for them. There are some Indian restaurants here, but not a lot. So what I suspect they'll do is they'll probably bring in a few hundred initially, a few thousand, and then ramp it up. Now, that is for workers. They may bring in caregivers. That's another possibility. And then keep in mind that's separate from the students. I believe there are 2,000 or 3,000 students here in Taiwan studying. And I know for a fact that some of the semiconductor companies are scouting universities in India looking for talent. Taiwan has a serious talent shortage, and India has a serious talent surplus of people of the right age. So it's a very happy marriage, it looks like. So I expect to see a lot more Indian professionals here. It wouldn't surprise me if students and professionals continue to outnumber workers for a fair period of time, because I think we're going to see a lot more of these professionals arriving from India.
That's great.
So
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Donovan. So now Rapaisa is here. So can you?
Yeah, thank you,
please?
Hi.
Thank you, Aravind. Hi. No, and thanks for there was some glitch. Sorry for it. But basically, I wanted to ask two questions. One is how you look at the KMT's future. KMT, of course, the changes are taking place. Still, they may be sticking to their old traditional roots. That is the first question. Second is how you look at their existing business interests in the mainland, how that is transforming. And
Okay.
third, if may ask, TPP, how long you will give, or will it go the way the older party is gone, and we will see again a two-party system in Taiwan? Thank you.
Okay, good questions. By the way, thanks. I'm glad you got to join us. Okay, so the KMT, as I mentioned in the presentation, their biggest short-term problem is they have a debt of over 600 million US dollars. And at some point, I don't know when all these loans are going to come due, but they no longer have those assets. They had $3.3 billion in assets that the nationalist government, with the KMT, seized from the outgoing Japanese government and gave it to the party. They also took some private property in some cases. They seized or coerced it out of people. So, when it was the one-party state, really the government and the party, they kind of blurred the lines. So if they get some property, they'd say, oh, we'll just give it to the party, or we'll give it to this government agency. They didn't really differentiate. So that was kind of the major problem. And for years, the KMT was billed as the world's richest political party because it had so many of these ill-gotten gains. And by the way, the KMT itself had been promising for years that they would divest themselves of this, but didn't. So finally, when the DPP won in a landslide, they went ahead and did it, and it was popular with the public. But the problem is that it used to be that the KMT, they would use, because they had so much money, what they would do is they would give loyalists party positions, to work for the party, and they would just, as Nathan Batto famously put it, they were professional tea drinkers and cigarette smokers. They would just sit around and do nothing. They were hired, to reward loyalty. So that's what they were there for. So what happened is that when the ill-gotten gain committee seized their assets, they had a huge number of people in the party they had to pay severance for and pensions. And so it drove the party into a ditch, basically. So that's the short-term problem. The second problem that they have is ideologically. Their support is almost entirely people over the age of 50. And they're slowly dying off. Now, they do have the advantage that these are fairly big demographics still relative to the young ones coming in, but they are aging. So at some point, they're going to have to either, assuming they don't go bankrupt, they're going to have to eventually change their ideology because their demographics will die off. Now, they probably got another 10, 20 years before this really bites hard. But, it will, it's going to hit them at some point. Now, will they change? Can they change? I think at some point there'll be a tipping point in demographics where it may become a possibility for them to do that. And keep in mind, the KMT has pivoted quite a few times in its history. So, it is a party that in the past has shown it's capable of reinventing itself. Now, as for the prospects of the TPP, I've written quite a lot on the subject. They have some strengths and weaknesses compared to the other parties that preceded them. One is that they're not a splinter party of another party. 3 of the 4 that came before them were splinter parties from the KMT, actually, even though one of them sided with the DPP because they were pro-independence KMT members who defected. So the TPP, the problems that they have is, and this is something actually I discovered just the other day when I was poring over election data. And that is, since 2016, when you look at the proportional representative seats, the party list seats, where voters just vote for parties, 16 parties submitted lists and made it to the voter rolls. So voters had a choice of 16 different parties. Almost exactly 30% in 2016, 2020, and this year in 2024 voted for parties other than the DPP or the KMT. Now this year, the big one got 22% was the TPP, but 7-point-something percentage voted for other parties who failed to make the 5% threshold to win a seat. So I found that very, very interesting. 30% consistently in 3 elections in a row, when given a choice of voting for the KMT, the DPP, or a range of other options, have consistently chosen the other options. And now I think this is a very interesting statistic. And this suggests that the only way, now the thing is that since about 7-8% of those people have consistently not voted for parties that actually passed the threshold to get a seat. So even though 30% represents 10 seats, in the last 3 elections, it's always been exactly 8 seats for parties who actually made it, into that, who actually won seats and passed the threshold. So I think that the TPP has pretty much maxed out its support with those voters, because the other voters, that other 7 or 8%, will probably continue to support extreme unification parties, extreme independence parties, or social cause parties, or the Green Party or something like that. So I think they're pretty close to have maxed out their potential support using this path. So the obverse of this is also true. This means that 70% in the last 3 election cycles are loyal, are partisan, at least partisan leaning, if not necessarily part of the base for the 2 major parties. So the only way the Kuomintang and the TPP can grow beyond where he is now is if he can start building a loyal partisan base of his own that he can poach from the other 2 parties. The main problem is he doesn't really have a guiding ideology for the party. And his stances when it comes to China and sovereignty and these issues are kind of a weak version of the KMT's, but without any ideological heft other than it's practical. That's it. It's not an idea. They pitch themselves as scientific, pragmatic, and practical. And while those are wonderful qualities in a politician, that's not a governing ideology, and they don't have one. So it's really hard to build a partisan base if you don't actually have anything to be partisan about, other than just being a fresh face. However, Kuomintang does realize, and he has said this, that the party needs to be moving away from gaining voters who hate the KMT and the DPP and gaining voters who vote for the TPP because they like the TPP. So he understands that at least. I don't know if he understands that transition point to actually having an ideology. So at this point, I think they've capped out. I think that because they relied so heavily on young voters, it's very hard to maintain that level of enthusiasm among young voters after 4 years of an election cycle, through 4 years, a new election cycle. There may be a new shiny party on the block for younger voters by then. We don't know. So I think that the TPP could survive. They've built up, I'd say, a roster of about 5 or 6 stars in the party, which is pretty good. They've gotten 22% of the party list vote, which is pretty good. Kuomintang did fairly well in the presidential election. They now have, enough money in government subsidies to actually make some inroads and build out, because the DPP and the KMT have had decades to build out their election machines, and the TPP hasn't been able to compete. But now they have the resources, still not as much as the two bigger parties, at 2.3 and 2.2 million or so. But at 1.5 is still a lot of money. I'm sorry, 8.3, 8.2 for million US for DPP and KMT, and 5 million for the TPP. And the TPP has been very, very good at using inexpensive social media and other methods that are have been low cost and high impact. They've been very adept at that. So they might be able to take that 5 million and get far more bang out of their buck for it than the KMT, because the KMT is paying debts, and maybe could match the TPP, at least subsidy by subsidy. But the DPP also gets a lot more corporate donations and party memberships because they're a much bigger party. So overall budget's still high, but I do think the TPP can stretch that. Their big challenge is to not only maintain the momentum that they've built so far, hold on to young voters, not split to pieces with personality clashes, which there have been some signs of this. And they need to build out, they have to plan carefully, build out their party machine, and start to become a positively oriented party, not just a negative one, and then come up with some unique ideology or stances that really give people something to believe in other than being practical and pragmatic.
Thank you, Donovan. So we have another 4 to 5 questions which are queued up. So we want to quickly take them up. Akshat, if you can read these questions, because I do not see the questions in the chat, in my chat box.
Sure. Certainly, sir. So we've got a question from Shikha Shaurya and from Colonel K.K. Venkatraman. I'll put both of them together. One is, what are the probabilities that influence the TPP's decision-making process in aligning with either the ruling Democratic Progressive Party or the KMT? And the second question is, could you please elaborate on the individual parties' approach to Taiwan's defense?
Okay, great questions. Okay, now the TPP, okay, during the election, there was a lot of talk of the TPP and the KMT forming a unity presidential ticket and cooperating in legislative races. In other words, in certain districts, one party would step aside and not run a candidate and let the other one run. Now, that actually did happen in the end in one district, for example, here in Taichung. But the negotiations on the unity presidential ticket collapsed very publicly and very embarrassingly, actually. And it was very messy. And there's maybe some bad blood now between the KMT and the TPP as a result. On the other hand, the TPP did a lot of campaigning in the election against the DPP, and spent a lot of time attacking them. Also, the TPP has a particular animosity toward the largest faction in the DPP, New Tide. William Lai is New Tide, although he just said he quit the faction, even though, ironically enough, the faction, according to party rules, isn't even supposed to exist, but everyone knows it does. So he said he quit New Tide. So the TPP, they had a chance to form a coalition when the new legislature formed. And they had a chance to maybe get some concessions out of either the KMT or the DPP for their votes for the speaker, because their votes could determine who the speaker became. And the TPP at the end of the day decided not to try and get any concessions, decided to try to preserve their independence, and ran their own candidate for speaker in the first round. That meant that none of the party's candidates for speaker won, and because you need an absolute majority in the first round, in the second round you just need a plurality. And what happened, and so the KMT had a bigger caucus, and so they won that way. So that seems to be signaling that the TPP wants to keep some independence and will not and maybe taking issues one at a time. Now, it also, because it has this leverage, it means that it could side with either one in crafting bills. Or it could, they may say to one of the other parties, okay, we'll back your bill if you back our bill for this, for our priority. These are all possibilities. But since voting really hasn't started yet, we don't, outside of the speaker race, we don't know exactly how they're going to line up on what issues and how closely they're going to be working together. My suspicion is they're going to work with the KMT far more than the DPP. And the reason I say this is because I think that they view themselves as a party that will be providing oversight over the ruling administration. And I think that is far more in line with their self-image, their public image, and how they want to present themselves as a party. So by aligning with the opposition KMT more often than not, they can say they're providing oversight. But I suspect they will occasionally work with the DPP to prove that they're not just a little KMT. That's how I guess it will play out. There is another possibility, and that is that they work with the DPP more, precisely because they are the ruling party, but they make a lot of demands, because a lot of legislature actually comes out of the executive branch and then is voted on in the legislature. This also could give the TPP a seat at the table in planning a lot of that legislation as well, or in having it changed to its priorities. And the TPP can also claim that is providing oversight. It may also encouraging Lai, when he comes in as when he's inaugurated in May, to possibly consider, and he said he hasn't ruled out bringing in people into the cabinet from other parties. This might tempt him to try and offer a cabinet position to somebody from the TPP. So there are multiple ways this could play out. I think the first scenario is a little bit more likely, but I wouldn't be surprised if the second one came to pass. There was a second question, wasn't there? I think I've forgotten what it was.
Yes, sir. It was with regard to how do each of these parties, the DPP, TPP, and KMT, look at the question of Taiwan's national defense. Okay.
All of them said that they want to strengthen it. They didn't really talk about a lot of specifics. Kuomintang and Hoyoi gave a specific target of 3% of GDP. Ko Wen-je did give some details about how he thought it was really important to concentrate on with the conscripts, how they're going to be trained. Ho Yo-i talked about pay rises. William Lai basically talked about more of the same, which is every year, for the last few years, the Tsai administration has bumped up the budget a bit every year. And presumably he wants to continue that, although he didn't give a specific target, unlike the other two candidates. The most colorful candidate dropped out. That was Foxconn founder Terry Gou. He wanted to stop buying American weapons. He wanted to develop Taiwan's weapons alone, including an army of 80,000 robots. He had some very interesting ideas. Slightly lunatic, but yeah, he was really the only one who came out with a lot of concrete proposals. The other candidates, there's been some vague talk about, training will be improved, conditions will be improved, recruit more troops, we'll develop more weapons locally. But it was all pretty much the same between all three candidates. Again, there wasn't a big ideological divide there. But I think Ko Wen-je probably talked the toughest of the three.
Can we take the next question?
Yes, sir. So we have two more questions. So first is, what are the prospects of the TPP? Is it possible for it to outsmart and outcompete the DPP in coming years, making Taiwan move forward from the binary of the KMT and the DPP that is built around the question of the nature of cross-strait relations? Is it possible that in the times to come, this fundamental divide becomes irrelevant for the Taiwanese voters and governance issues become primary issues for them? And the second one, is it possible that some even more flexible version of the one country, two systems, while it still upholds the one China policy, may emerge from the PRC? For example, a confederation of two Chinese states.
That was could the TPP outsmart the DPP? Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Could they outsmart them? It's theoretically possible. At this point, they've shown no signs of being. I mean, they have outsmarted the DPP in appealing to youth voters in one election cycle. That is not a comprehensive outsmarting, though. And it's going to take a lot more than what they've done so far to build up just the simple infrastructure that the DPP has. And the DPP has a lot of loyal followers. It's going to be very hard to peel them off. So Ko would have to come up with some kind of new stance on sovereignty that would be at least nearly as strong as the DPP's, I think, to poach voters from the DPP. I think that's really the only way they could do it. They may have more luck poaching parties from the voters from the KMT side. That to me seems a little bit more likely than taking them from the DPP side. Now, as for a different formulation from the 1992 consensus, something needs to be made clear here: the difference between the one China principle and the one China policy. The one China policy was included in the question. The one China principle is what China and the KMT both believe in. And that is that Taiwan is a part of China. Period. That's it. Now, there are a few countries around that actually have signed on for the one China principle. I think Spain is one of them, and a lot of little countries. Nicaragua just signed on to that. Anyway, the one China policy is countries like, I don't know about, no, India is a one China policy country. Although I believe your government hasn't mentioned it since, it was 2008 or 2009, which is very interesting. The one China policy is held by also countries like the United States, the UK, Japan, Canada, a lot of other European countries as well, and India, I believe. Now, the American version of it, the other countries have slight variations, but what they all say is something along the lines of, we acknowledge or we recognize the Chinese position that Taiwan is a part of China. Now, if I were to say, isn't my Thai absolutely wonderful? And you said, I recognize that you think your Thai is very wonderful, that's not the same thing as saying that it's true, right? And so essentially, everybody's saying, you can boil this down to, if you're just using a normal conversation, the US position, the British position, you know, all these countries' positions are all basically, yeah, we know you think that. So that's the difference between a one China policy and a one China principle. Another thing to add about the United States in particular is, because after the Treaty of San Francisco was signed, and then later the Treaty of Taipei, this is when it was written in 1951, and I think it was signed in 1952. This is when the Japanese formally, because in 1895, the Qing dynasty ceded Taiwan to the Japanese Empire in perpetuity. So they had to sign a treaty so that Japan relinquished its claims on Taiwan. So it said, Taiwan is no longer part of Japan. But neither of those two treaties that they signed said to whom sovereignty was to be given. And this is another very interesting detail that a lot of people don't realize, is that legally, the Republic of China was not on Taiwan to be given sovereignty. It was on Taiwan to represent the Allied powers. So, for example, when Germany was partitioned into the Soviet zone, the American zone, the British zone, and the French zones, Japan, the Taiwan zone, representing the Allies in that zone, was the Republic of China. And then the United States and the British and Australians in a small pocket there held the mainland islands of Japan. So the US's official position on Taiwan's sovereignty is it's undetermined, which a lot of people aren't aware of that. Now, the State Department doesn't mention that very often publicly because the Chinese get all irate about it. But there was at least one official did say that publicly once or twice in the Trump administration. But that is the actual official American policy. So could China come up with another, as long as the Chinese Communist Party is in power? No. It would have to be some variation on the one China principle. They could come up with new fancy words for it. But, for example, the 1992 consensus, according to the CCP side, is that the KMT and the CCP agreed there is one China, period. The KMT claims that the 1992 consensus is there is one China, each side with its own interpretation. The CCP has never accepted the KMT's formulation. So as far as the CCP is concerned, Taiwan belongs to the People's Republic of China. Now, if the CCP were to fall and there were a new government that would come in, I think it would be the same. And the reason I say this is that the way that Chinese are raised in China, the nationalistic education that they're given, and the whole sort of dahanrenzuyi mentality, this great Chinese nation thinking that they have, you know, they view China as, and it is a long, you know, proud history and culture, but they do genuinely have been taught that Taiwan is an inalienable part of China and has been since forever, even though the Dutch were here before the indigenous people were here long before them. Then the Dutch were actually the ones who imported labor from China to work the fields and build stuff. So it really actually has only been since the 17th century, but they were both part of the Qing dynasty, which is technically Manchurian, but that's a whole other story. So yeah, I think just because of the sheer nationalism that Chinese have, even if they brought in, say, a democratic country, they became a democratic country, I mean, tensions would probably lower, or could lower significantly. But I can't imagine a non-nationalistic Chinese government. I actually just wrote the other day on why I don't think, no matter what, as long as China remains a unified state, the same is true for Tibet. They will not give Tibet their independence back, primarily because they would be afraid that Tibet, because all the water from the Yellow River, the Yangtze, the Mekong rivers, the Indus and the Brahmaputra, I think it's called, in India, all come from the Tibetan Plateau. As long as China holds the Tibetan Plateau, 48% of the water that comes off the Tibetan Plateau goes into India. The Chinese have control over that. They could weaponize it if they wanted to, and they're building more dams, so they could. But they won't let Tibet be independent, even if they became a democratic state, because they would be afraid that Tibet would fall into India's orbit, or worse, that India would invade Tibet. I don't even think that they would be thinking, would India do it or not? I think that the very thought that India could do it, would even just have the remote possibility of doing it, they would find so terrifying, because all of northern China is, you know, Beijing, for example, has less water per person than Saudi Arabia. So whoever controls the source of the Yellow River and the Yangtze rivers basically controls the lifeblood of China. So much as I would love to see Tibet become independent again, I just don't see it happening for that reason. Anyway, so again, Taiwan, nationalistically, because of its position in the first island chain, and because of the nationalistic mentality of Chinese, I don't see a new government coming in changing their position very much. They may be more peaceful about it, but I don't see them changing their stance. They could actually, a new government could even be worse, because they might be fueled by nationalist populism and run on that, and they may be running, you know, they may be trying to seize power, and part of their campaign on that might be the CCP has failed to take back Taiwan, so we must overthrow them. That's a distinct possibility. So I think that for Taiwan and Tibet, the only way that the situation changes is if China falls apart into warlordism.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. So
Sorry, that's
Akshat,
not very cheerful.
so Akshat, are we done with the questions? I think we have covered all of these questions, if I'm not wrong.
And they were
Yes,
great
so,
questions, by the way. I thought all of them were excellent questions.
so there's just one
Yes.
more question.
Okay.
I'll
The last
shorten
question.
it.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
It essentially asks how polarized is the Taiwanese population on the question of cross-strait relations?
This is a slightly complicated question. It's a great question, by the way, but it's a complicated one. And the reason I say this is for two reasons. One is that in a sense, it used to be a lot more polarized in some ways, particularly, say, in the 1990s. The DPP was crying out for, the Republic of Taiwan, which I really hope they would not call it that, because the acronym would be ROT, rot. Taiwan Republic or Taiwan would be a far better name. But anyway, the KMT was still talking about, was coming out of a period where they're talking about reclaim the mainland, all of this. So in a sense, the polarization was far more intense then. What's happened in the meantime is, now fundamentally it is polarized in the sense that either you believe in reunification or you don't, or you think that Taiwan should declare itself or rename itself Taiwan or a Taiwan Republic now or soon. But then there's a large chunk of people who are in the middle who basically want to maintain the current status quo because they don't want to die. So effectively what they want is to maintain what Tsai Ing-wen has called the Republic of China independence, the independent Republic of China. Because China has made it absolutely clear that if Taiwan changed its name, there would be missiles raining down, and blowing up our cities. And generally speaking, people don't want to have that happen to them. So, the largest chunk of people want to maintain a status quo and just sort of keep this going because Taiwan is de facto independent. So the percentage of people who want independence and the percentage of people who want unification now or anytime soon is tiny. The percentage of people who want to declare the country, change its name to Taiwan, is a bit bigger, but it's still not huge. However, when people are asked either sort of in an ideal world sort of way, or if the threat of invasion from China did not exist, what would you want to do? And then you get large majorities would want to change the name to Taiwan. So the reality is there's kind of a continuum going on, except that at the extreme ends, you have people who want to declare independence and change the name of the country, and those who want to unify and then with China soon. But then there's a second group, and people like Ma Ying-jeou, the former president, falls into this category. He was setting the stage for unification with China. If you look back at all of his policies and you go through it all, he's bringing down the military, he's trying to get the services packed in, he was bringing in all the tourists and the students and trying to make it as easy as possible to integrate the two countries. Now he claims that he thinks that he in a DW interview just before the election, which the KMT ran in terror from, but he laid out his plan for why he thought Taiwan should be unified with China. And he's looking at, in the interview, he was saying a few decades. My feeling is from the pace that he was moving for closer integration with China, when he was in office, I think his hope was more along the lines of maybe a decade or two. So then there's people like him, and then there's, people, then there's a big chunk of people who would like to be called Taiwan, what the so-called independence. There's a big chunk of them, but okay, we'll live with the name Republic of China for now, whatever. And then there's always that 5 or 10% of the population who answers, I don't know, on any poll that you ask them. And so unless they're advocating for an I don't know nation, there is always that percentage who has no clue. So there is a little bit of a continuum. So within the KMT, you've got people who want unification quickly. You got people who want unification slowly. You've got a bloc that just wants good relations with China and more integration because they do business there and they have family there, but don't necessarily want to actually unify with China. And then there are some that support the KMT who want status quo indefinitely. But they generally, if they're in the KMT, they want better relations with China, or at least a decrease in tensions across the Taiwan Strait. So, like I say, there's a bit of a continuum here. But it is still the big dividing issue. And there's other manifestations of it, by the way. The education curriculum. Should it be more Taiwan-centric? Or should it be previously, it taught the broad scope of Chinese civilization with a little bit about Taiwan in its role in the great sweep of Chinese civilization. DPP came in, changed the curriculum to put the history of Taiwan front and center, and China within the context of East Asia. So these kinds of issues can be very contentious and very polarizing. Because there are Taiwanese who don't necessarily want to unify with China, but still they call themselves, in polling, the percentage of the population, the most famous poll, the National Zhengzhi Daxue poll on identity they've been doing since 1992. Generally, it's like 2% or 2.5% of the population in Taiwan calls themselves Chinese only. I actually did some thumbnail calculations. There's about 500,000 spouses from China in Taiwan who are Chinese. There's still a fair number of old people who are actually born in China before 1949, or were born in Taiwan just after 1949 to Chinese parents. But if you just take people who are actually from China, I realized it was pretty close to the percentage of people that survey identify as Chinese only. About 2/3 or so identify as Taiwanese only, and about 30% or so as both Chinese and Taiwanese. So the percentage of the people who actually identify as just Chinese, the majority of those people are actually Chinese. They were born in China, and maybe a few of them were born to refugees from China soon after the Chinese Civil War. So.
Okay.
There are no more questions, sir. Thank you so much.
All right.
Okay, so we have consumed our full time, and we tried to put a maximum questions which we received from the audience. Don't know, that was exciting. So the way democracy is taking shape in Taiwan and the way it is interpreted domestically and cross-strait in regional affairs, it stands out that it is something phenomenal which is going to be studied by most of us, and then those who are looking carefully how China is changing, how China is trying to locates its position vis-a-vis Taiwan. From one party to two party, the second party, DPP, which emerged under the single party system. Then you have a third party. And as you said, there is a cycle of one party usually exists or stays until 3 cycles of elections. And then if you look into the entire dynamics of how nationalism plays out or sovereignty plays out, then it is said that it takes 2 to tango, and now you have 3 here to do the tango, and many more actually. Then you would say that how these things are trying to play an important role, and being a democratic country like India, we see these things quite inspiring, quite differently. When not as a political scientist, but somebody who is studying IR or somebody who is studying into area studies, so China specifically or Taiwan specific. So these things are quite important to most of the audiences and participants who participated in the program. So you have answered all these questions and queries quite efficiently. So on behalf of Institute of Chinese Studies, let me thank you and thank everyone who have been over here. And we would like to keep in touch with you in the mailing list. And going forward, we would like to have more talks and more interactions with you. Thank you for being on board, and thank you for being our guest, Donovan. Thank you so much.
I'm always very happy when India is paying attention to Taiwan. I think that's always a really good thing, because I think Taiwan and India are in so many ways very complementary, in the businesses they do, in everything from demographics. There's just a whole lot of things where I think that Taiwan and India would make really good partners. So I think that I really do think that a good relationship between India and Taiwan going forward would be a fantastic thing. So I'm always excited when there's interest in shown on Taiwan and India. So I'm happy to be here.
Thank you.
And they were great questions, so I was enjoyed answering them too. So that was fun.
Thank you so much again, Akshat.
Yes, sir.
Right.
With your permission, shall we bring today's seminar to an answer?
Yes, please. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we come to the end of today's special lecture. We thank Mr. Smith and Dr. Yellery for gracing today's lecture with their presence and for giving us their precious time. The video of today's session shall be available on the ICS's YouTube channel. The ICS conducts seminars every Wednesday, and further information regarding the topics can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, everybody.